So, in the Country of the Blind, Chapter 2. A dead body causes a lot of problems, aside from screwing up a first date. For one thing, it forces us to look at our own mortality. And if the body didn't achieve its deadness by natural causes, it poses a threat to the illusion that we live in an orderly civil society. In response, we mobilize a vast army of policemen, forensic technicians, prosecutors, defense lawyers, and judges to identify, analyze, and classify the threat. That army is presided over by politicians and policymakers who live off the community's fragile perception of order and safety, and thus must safeguard that perception at all costs. The primary benefit of this system, perhaps the only benefit, is the elimination of the feud, the 12 o'clock high shootout in the middle of the street. In order to avoid such affronts to the community's dignity, we submit to the lazy and inefficient machine that passes for a justice system. Thus, death cranks up a bureaucracy that rolls like a panzer division toward the Maginot Line of privacy, crushing everything in its path, including the truth. I didn't know it at the time, but I was going to be standing in front of those tanks. In the days following Alex's murder, Cynthia's grief was compounded by this bureaucracy, where what appeared to be an extreme lack of sensitivity and care was merely the workings of a system in which violent death is routine. This was clear immediately following Detective Cleary's announcement that Alex was dead. Before Cynthia had a chance to grasp what Cleary had said, we were startled by a shout. We turned to see one of the coroner's assistants fall down the stoop. He had stumbled and was reaching wildly for the iron railing. He had been holding one end of a stretcher carrying a black nylon body bag. The bag slipped off the stretcher and caught on a sharp protrusion from a baluster, and the weight of the bag, combined with its momentum, caused it to tear open and spill its contents at Cynthia's feet. In life, Alex Penworth had been a handsome young man. In death, he was unrecognizable. His face was a deep purple, darker around his protruding eyes, one of which was discolored from a burst blood vessel. His swollen tongue bulged from his mouth, and his nose was flattened and off-center. A piece of fabric cinched in a tight slip knot cut into the skin of his neck. A frayed end of this makeshift noose peeked out from behind his right ear. The hand that had escaped carnage about to burst from a translucent membrane. I turned too late to block Cynthia's view. As I grasped her upper arms, a low moan escaped her lips and rose to a high, keening wail as she struggled to look over my shoulder at the remains of her dear friend. Gently, I guided her toward a stoop across the street. The uniformed cop followed at a respectful distance. Behind us, I heard Cleary shout about preservation of evidence and tell the coroner's assistant to get the fucking body back in the bag. I sat down on the stoop with Cynthia as she clung to my neck and sobbed. I waved the uniformed officer over. As he approached, I read his name tag. Officer Sikorsky, could you find us a blanket, please? Sure, he said. He retrieved two from the nearest squad car, and as he returned, he was intercepted by Detective Cleary, who took the blankets from him. Here, he said, handing me the blankets. The stoop was cold, so I pulled Cynthia up just enough to slip one of the folded blankets underneath her. She still had her arms wrapped firmly around my neck, and I fumbled with the other blanket. Finally, Cleary helped me tuck it around her. He straightened up and shook his head as the coroner's assistants loaded the body into the wagon, backed up to get around a squad car, and drove away. As they rounded the corner, they hit the siren, and Cynthia, whose sobs had begun to subside, erupted in a loud cry again. Idiots, Cleary said, and sat down next to me, clenching and unclenching his fists. We're going to need to speak to her, he said to me. You think she'll be okay to talk in a while? This is our first date. I don't know. Where did you guys meet? At a little theater downtown, I said. Why? I was slightly incredulous that he would make small talk at a time like this. It would help us get a fix on the time. Oh, you mean tonight? I picked her up here at around 7:30. Was a roommate home? Yes. I didn't spend any time there, just picked her up, but I saw him. Cleary nodded. A man holding a camera with a flash jogged out the front door and down the steps toward a black van parked behind the squad cars. He pulled open the van's rear doors, retrieved a small black suitcase, and ran back into the building. I heard a crackling sound, and Cleary pulled a small walkie-talkie from inside his baseball jacket. Yeah? A voice crackled back. I think we can wrap it up here, leave the rest to the techs. It looks like he had a roommate. I'm posting someone in case she comes home. She's here. Oh, great. We can... Hold on a sec. The walkie crackled, was silent, then spat again. The doc wants to talk to her. I'll bring him down. Right. Cleary put the radio back under his jacket. Her upstairs neighbor is a doc at St. Luke's. He discovered the body. Maybe he can give us something. I nodded and tucked the blanket back under Cynthia's chin. The tide of tears that was rocking her body had begun to ebb, but I continued to hold her while we waited on the stoop. The rhythmic flashing of the squad car lights was a soothing counterpoint to the intermittent crackle of the police radios. Two men came out of Cynthia's building, one of them in hospital scrubs underneath an eggplant-colored Patagonia ski jacket. Although tall and lanky, he had to trot to keep up with the much smaller man who moved briskly towards us across the street. At 5'4", he exuded the intimidating energy of a small man trying to make up in output what he lacks in size. He was black and clean-shaven, with a high-domed, balding head and a fringe of hair that was trimmed very short and graying at the temples. He was dressed in earth tones, loafers, tailored slacks, a cashmere sweater, and a thick leather coat with a shawl collar. As I stood, he approached. He glanced at Cynthia. Is that her? Yeah. Who's this guy, her boyfriend? No, I interjected. We met a couple of days ago. We were just having dinner. You knew the roommate? No. I mean, I met him too, the same time I met Cynthia, but we never spoke more than a couple of words to each other. So you wouldn't know anything about this? No. Okay, so why don't you take off? We got it from here. I frowned. I'd like to stay if it's okay. She seems pretty upset. The black cop, who hadn't introduced himself, shook his head and glanced at Cleary with a smirk. First date, you said. That's right. Well, her neighbor here is a doctor. I'm sure he can give her something to calm her down, and then we're going to need to take her inside to talk to her, unless you'd rather do it all out here in the cold. So why don't you go home and get some rest? He turned away from me to say something to Cleary. I touched him gently on the arm. Excuse me, I said, you need to talk to her tonight? He looked at my hand on his arm, then at me. Yes. I took my hand away. Is she a suspect? He rolled his eyes at Cleary. Yeah, he's a suspect, okay? That do it? Date's over. You're not getting laid tonight. Go home. I had what I wanted. I'm her attorney, and if she's a suspect, I'll stay. That is, if it's okay with you, Detective... He stared at me for a moment and then glanced at Cynthia, who had begun to follow the conversation. Is that true? She nodded. Yes, she said. Good girl. Yes, it is. The black cop glared, then released a breath. Shit. He turned to the neighbor. Why don't you see if she needs anything? We need to talk to her and I want her calmed down, but don't give her anything that knocks her out, okay? The neighbor nodded. All right, you all wait here. He turned away and I called after him. Detective? He stopped and turned, irked. What do you want? I still didn't get your name. Jenkins, he snapped. He walked with Cleary to the squad car, leaned against the hood and jabbed a finger in my direction while they spoke. The neighbor crouched and took Cynthia's hands. Jesus, Cynthia, you're freezing. Are you okay? She shuddered, pulled away, and wrapped herself more tightly in the blanket. Sin, do you need anything? She glared at him with red-rimmed eyes and shook her head. He stood and took in the squad cars, their lights still flashing. I'm Zach Brandis, I said. Oh, right. Cynthia mentioned you. Hank Chernin. I live upstairs. What happened here? I asked. I don't know. When I came home, their door was ajar. I knocked and nobody answered. I was worried that Maxie, that's their cat, that it'd get out. So I looked in and there was Alex. He trailed off and shook his head. We were silent, waiting for the detectives to tell us what was going to happen next. Then Cynthia spoke. What did you see? She asked. Hank said, what do you mean? What did you see when you opened the door? Sin, I don't. He was dead. That's all I know. Bullshit. I'm not asking you what you know. I'm asking you a simple question. She raised her voice and the detectives looked over at us. What did you see when you opened the door? Sin, I don't think now is the... Cynthia stood up and spoke sharply. There is no good time to talk about it. My best friend is dead. Now tell me, what did you see when you opened the door? Hank looked to me for help, but I had none to give. She had to deal with this in her own way. Right now, she wanted simple information, and I waited with her for his response. He took a deep breath and then spoke in the clinically compassionate voice he must use to deliver bad news in the emergency room. Alex was hanging from the water pipe running across the kitchen ceiling. It appears that he hung himself. However, in the case of an apparent suicide, homicide detectives have to investigate and an autopsy is required. Cynthia remained still, crying silently. I tried to put my arm around her, but she shook it off and wrapped herself more tightly in the blanket before sitting back down and rocking herself. I tugged Hank a few steps away. Do you think he killed himself? I asked. I don't know. It looks that way, but the police seem to be asking a lot of questions. Like what? Well, they were canvassing the building, asking people if they had heard sounds of any struggle. They asked me, but like I said, I was coming home from my shift at the ER, so I wasn't there to hear anything. They've got Mrs. Dubin below them, but she can't hear a thing, and the Kristens across the hall are still away. The police think it might not be suicide? I don't know. They're asking a lot of questions. Why? I don't know. Once I saw he was dead, I didn't do or touch anything. I just went to my apartment and called 911. Jesus. His voice skipped. I didn't even cut him down. Don't worry about it, Doc, said Jenkins, who had approached silently. He'd been dead for a good long time before you got there. Remind me to commend you to your lieutenant for your sensitivity, Detective, I said to Jenkins. Anytime, he said with a sarcastic smile. He jammed his hands into the pockets of his coat. Do you have a problem, Counselor, if we ask the young lady to view the crime scene? Detective, I said, lowering my voice, her best friend and roommate just killed himself in that apartment. Do you really need her to go in there right now? Jenkins got right in my face. I didn't back up. Listen, cute boy, he said. I'm sorry your romantic evening was cut short. I'm really sorry your new squeeze is having a tough night. I'm really sorry I'm missing the Knicks game because I had courtside tickets. But I'm also sorry that this young man is dead, and I'm mostly sorry that it looks a little hinky, because if it didn't, I could write it off as a definite suicide pending a coroner's inquest and still get home before my wife is asleep and we miss her ovulation window again and I have to put up with her crap for another month. So I need your new flame to look at the apartment because we don't happen to live there, and she might be able to tell if anything is missing or out of place. That, in turn, will give us a clue as to whether this is a murder, and if it is, where we might start looking for the killer. Is all of that clear? Is all of that all right with you, Counselor? I looked at him and thought of a lot of things to say. None of them were witty, so I didn't say anything. I walked back to the stoop and told Cynthia what the detectives needed. Do you feel up to it? She nodded and stood, and we followed Jenkins to her building. Hank and Cleary took up the rear as we trudged silently up the 3 flights of stairs to apartment 4R. When we got there, another uniform in front of the door stepped aside for us to get by in the cramped turn of the stairwell. Jenkins shoved open the apartment door and stepped inside. Cynthia paused on the threshold, took a deep breath, and then crossed over. I started to follow her in, but Jenkins put up a hand to stop me just inside the door. "You wait here while she looks around." I nodded, and Hank stood by my side. Cleary squeezed past, and he and Jenkins followed Cynthia through the archway between the eating kitchen and the living room. She paused there, impassive, and slowly surveyed the room. Then she headed down the short hallway toward the back. Jenkins and Cleary remained in the hallway as she disappeared to the right into one of the 2 bedrooms. I caught a glimpse as she came out of that bedroom and drifted into the second one farther back. Then she returned, squeezing past the detectives back into the kitchen. Jenkins cleared his throat. "Well?" he asked. "Everything looks fine. It doesn't look like anything's been stolen." Jenkins looked at Cleary. "Shit. There's something wrong, though, I think." "What do you mean?" asked Cleary. "It just feels weird. I can't explain it. Do you know the comedian with the line about waking up in the morning to discover that everything in his apartment has been replaced with an exact replica? That's how this feels. Everything is just a little off, like we got a new cleaning lady. Have you guys been moving stuff around?" "Nothing's been moved," said Jenkins, "except the body." As he spoke, I caught sight of the severed end of the piece of fabric, still knotted around the water pipe directly above Cynthia's head, a macabre Halloween twist on mistletoe. I winced, and Cynthia followed my gaze. She saw the cord, and again a low moan began deep in her throat as she lifted her arms in supplication. I saw it coming, and when her knees buckled, I caught her before she hit the floor.